Today we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration, and the goal of this video is to describe the process that the cell uses to make ATP in the absence of oxygen. So let's first give a quick recap of cellular respiration. During cellular respiration, glucose and oxygen are used to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. This is done in 3 steps. Step 1 is glycolysis. And if oxygen is present, you continue on to step 2 and 3. Step 2 is the Krebs cycle, and step 3 is the electron transport chain. But what if there's no oxygen? When oxygen is absent, the cell can still produce ATP, but it does it through a process called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration involves 2 steps. Step 1 is glycolysis. Step 2 is fermentation. During glycolysis, the cell gains 2 ATP, and during fermentation, the cell gains 2 ATP. So when you put those 2 steps together, anaerobic respiration produces a total of 4 ATP. Both of those steps occur in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, there are 2 different types of fermentation. The first is called lactic acid fermentation, and the second is called alcoholic fermentation. During lactic acid fermentation, the cell produces ATP, but it also produces lactic acid. And this is actually the process. Lactic acid fermentation is the process that's used to create yogurt and cheese. Human cells also perform lactic acid fermentation when engaging in strenuous activity. So when you're exercising, your muscle cells, for example, perform lactic acid fermentation, and those muscle cells produce lactic acid, and that lactic acid is what causes that burning sensation and soreness of muscles after you've worked out. Alcoholic fermentation is a bit different. Instead of producing lactic acid, it produces ethyl alcohol, which is alcohol that you can drink. And it also produces carbon dioxide gas. Now, this process, alcoholic fermentation, is used to make wine and bake bread. So when you take the sugar that's in grapes and allow it to ferment, so put it in a container like a wine bottle and seal it so no oxygen can get in, those sugars begin to ferment and ethyl alcohol is produced, which makes it wine at that point because it's grape juice that's alcoholic. Now, the other example here that I've got on the slide is a piece of bread. So you'll notice there are these little holes in the bread. Those little pockets, those little holes are produced because when you take yeast cells in the bread, those yeast cells undergo alcoholic fermentation. So they produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. So when you're baking bread, ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide is being produced. The carbon dioxide is a gas that rises, and that's what causes the bread, the dough, to rise, and it creates these little air pockets full of carbon dioxide, and that's what you see in the bread. Now you may wonder, well, what happens to all the alcohol if my bread produces alcohol as well? The alcohol bakes off of the bread, so all of it evaporates, and so what you're left with is bread with these little holes in it due to the air pockets from the carbon dioxide. Let's finish up by talking about some of the advantages that each of these types of respiration have, aerobic versus anaerobic. So aerobic respiration has an advantage over anaerobic because aerobic respiration produces a whole lot more ATP per molecule of glucose. So during aerobic respiration, 38 ATP are produced, whereas during anaerobic respiration, only 4 ATP are produced. So way more energy gets produced during aerobic respiration. However, anaerobic respiration has two advantages in its favor. One is anaerobic respiration lets organisms live in places where there's little or no oxygen. They may think, what would be examples of that? So if you're in deep water, like out deep in the ocean, there's not going to be very much oxygen available. If you're in deep soil, not going to be a whole lot of oxygen available. And also in the digestive tract of animals. So like in your intestines and your stomach, it's going to be a place of low oxygen. So various organisms, bacteria, and so forth can live in these sorts of environments because they're able to do anaerobic respiration. So that's an advantage that anaerobic respiration has over aerobic. There's one more as well, and that is that anaerobic respiration produces ATP more quickly than aerobic respiration. So even though anaerobic respiration produces less ATP, it makes that ATP faster than aerobic respiration.